This is the Black Information Network Daily Podcast, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja. And sometimes the amount of stories that make their way to us means that we simply can't cover everything that comes our way. But from time to time, a story just stays with me, and I feel compelled to share it with you and give you my thoughts. And now, one more thing.
I got one more thing I'd like to talk to you about right now.
Okay, so today I was having a conversation with a dear friend of mine. Her name is Paola. Our kids play together, and she came over, and while our kids were playing, we got to talking and just catching up. And she asked about the latest and greatest with respect to my radio show, Civic Cipher. And so that got us to a conversation talking about the origin of Civic Cipher so that we had a benchmark to compare how far that show had come, which obviously was a surprise to both of us here. And then the conversation started to get a little bit more interesting. You know, Paola, I want you to tell our listeners a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and then we'll get into a little bit more of what we were talking about.
Sure. So I'm originally from Chile,
Mm-hmm.
even though I was born in Germany because my parents were working in Germany at the time, and then we moved to South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So I lived in Johannesburg and Pretoria until I was 8 years old. And then we moved back to Chile, where I spent my entire childhood and teen years. I came to the States when I was 16 to study in North Carolina. Then I went back to Chile to work. And then I moved back to the States in 1998, and I've been living here ever since.
Okay. So it's safe to say that you have a more global view of things, including politics, than most folks would.
I guess so. Yes. I mean,
that
yes.
comes from the statistic that I believe it's 80% of Americans don't have a passport. So that to me suggests that there are people who have no concept of what day-to-day life is like outside of the US.
Yes.
Right?
Okay. So then, yes, it is safe.
Sure. Now, something interesting and why I really wanted to capture this conversation for the benefit of our listeners is I recognize that there are a lot of people out there who are always going to be supportive of policing as it is done now. This is the reality that everyone has known, and it is very difficult to conceive of something that could work better. One of the things that you mentioned earlier when we were talking is, officers need better training.
Mental training. Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one of the things that you mentioned is that if we were going to compare the policing as it's done in the United States to policing as it's done in other countries, you pick Chile. And I'd like for you to tell our listeners a little bit about what policing is like in that country and the pushback and what sort of resources police have, et cetera, so that they'll be able to follow along.
Now, I do want people to keep in mind that I haven't been living in Chile since 98, right? And my experience going back and forth from visiting and is mainly from things that I hear from my friends,
Mm-hmm.
videos that I see, that are sent not from the news media, but just stuff that they've recorded on their own and things are going. So, my understanding is what we were talking about is that the police in Chile don't have weapons that can cause death. So basically the guns that they possess are more like pellet guns, where you can, if you hit somebody in the face or in the eye, you can cause blindness, but you can't really per se kill. And so that's been my understanding. So, and there also is, because way in the past, because of the military dictatorship after he stepped down, which he stepped down because he put it to a vote. So he did a democratic vote. So I think he's the only dictator in the world, in the history, that stepped down because the people voted him out as opposed to him being overthrown or, So there was a huge human rights, movement that happened during his dictatorship and afterwards.
Okay.
So It's always been kind of my understanding that the police in Chile it's like a double-edged sword, where if people are in trouble, they want to go and protect them, but part of them feels with their hands tied where they can't really do much, because if they do, then they get the human rights people against them saying you violated the human rights of these people.
Sure.
So it's a really complicated situation down there. And it's not just, it doesn't stem just from that, but now, unfortunately, there's a lot of the narcos have come into South America, into Chile specifically. So things have changed significantly since I've been there. And so there's a lot of weapons there. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine sent me a graph, statistics of the amount of weapons per household, I think, that people had. And United States, of course, is number one.
Sure.
And I was so surprised, really just appalled, that number 2 is Chile.
Really?
Tiny little skinny country, long, not even half the population that maybe 2 states have here. And it's number 2. And that in my world before I left, that wasn't a thing at all. People didn't have guns. Now, I just got a video yesterday from my friend in a mall. They're assaulting the mall with, what is it called? The machine guns, the ones that go ta-ta-ta-ta-ta.
Yeah.
And you can see them. And you can see them running through the stores with the machine guns go ta-ta-ta-ta-ta.
Yeah.
And people are hiding, and what do? They can't, just, so it's hard. It's a hard situation. Yeah.
So here's the thing. I'm glad that you brought that up, because there are a lot of sensible people who will compare the United States to other countries where they prioritize the population at large over the police. In this country, in the U.S., I believe that we prioritize, every officer must get home safe at the end of the day. They put their lives on the line, as though there's some higher value to that life form than a value assigned to a person who does not do that specific job. Right. This is something that this aperture into life in Chile is something that really helps to affirm the status quo here. We don't want to devolve into something like that. And so,
sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, because what's happening right now is people don't feel safe anymore.
Right.
So that's the thing, is after a certain time of the day, say 5, 6 o'clock, people don't go out.
Right.
There are certain areas of town that before you could walk around at night, party, go to nightclubs. Now you can't, because you'll get murdered. And so it's like the other side of the spectrum, where it's so much is focused on the population and not enough on the police. And then you have the opposite, where
it's a double-edged sword. You either get too much of this or too much of that. That's a fair point. So the reason we ended up having our conversation is because we were talking about some of the whys surrounding the creation of Civic Cypher, the radio show. And one such why was, I felt, me and Q, my co-host on the show, we felt that we needed to create a space in the media where the protesters on the street could come up and explain why they were so upset about Breonna Taylor and the death of Breonna Taylor, and what defund the police means, because without context, that statement in and of itself can be very alarming. So, to have a space where people come up who have rethought top to bottom what policing should be, what it should prioritize, and how to make it work better for most people, was necessary and mission critical to the plight of everyone that was protesting, because the people on the streets with the bullhorns and the signs felt unsafe. Right? So what happens is, first and foremost, this is my understanding. Again, I'm not the architect of the defund the police movement, but I appreciate the conversation, because I've always known you to be a very sensible person, and your husband, Ian, is a very sensible, measured man.
Thank you.
He's been a guest on the show before as well. And, or he's been a guest on Civic Cypher before.
Yes, he has.
So I appreciate the fact that you are people who vote, people who I believe to be kind people, people who could serve as a sort of litmus test to how people might be feeling. Non-Black people might be feeling about Black issues, so forth and so on.
Right.
And, as business owners, as people who are, have a bit of status and a bit of mobility in society, you're in a unique position of not being desperate for certain outcomes and to be objective with respect to certain things. So I appreciate you allowing me to have this conversation, and I would love for you to continue to ask questions. I know we started the conversation a little bit ago, but continue to ask questions because, again, for the benefit of listeners who are, again, sensible people who don't recognize how far-reaching I don't believe it to be really radical, but I'll say radical style of thinking can be and how it could conceivably work for everyone. It definitely needs to pass inspection. So
Yeah.
the first thing that I want to say is that, again, my understanding of defunding the police, it is not abolishing the police. There is a movement that really does seek to abolish and rebuild because people feel like the culture of policing is sort of rotted to its core. The police recruit people who tend to be violent already, and then empower them with the ability to end lives, and so forth and so on. But the defunding part of the equation, or the facet that really was being very strategic in the defunding efforts, really sought to create programs that really had a direct impact on the crimes that really do plague the cities. And there are measured and documented initiatives and imperatives that have a direct correlation with crime rates. These things, most crimes, and if you just think about it, if you've never heard any of these discussions before, most crimes, the vast majority, are crimes of poverty, just people being poor and trying their best to get ahead or to get by, right? Most crimes stem from that. A good chunk of other crimes are based on an otherwise lack of resources, mental health resources, abuse resources, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
And so by investing in, let's say, a war on poverty rather than a war on drugs, something like that would affect crime rates by far and away more than investing in more policing.
Yeah.
It's like, let me get a bigger stick and then they'll listen. And what's the word I'm looking for? It ignores human nature, which is to survive and, if possible, to thrive, right?
Well, this is why I like having conversations with you all the time, because I feel that there's a knowledge to be gained. So for all your listeners, I think that you are all very lucky that you have a person who is willing to look at both sides of the coin, let's put it that way. And because a lot of people, I think we're at fault as a society, for not trying to inform ourselves more. I think people out there, I might be generalizing here, defund the police, and they'll make their own idea of what that is.
Sure. Even me, when I first heard it, I was like, that's crazy.
Right. And it could be, that's crazy good or that's crazy bad, whichever way you want to think about it.
Crazy bad,
right?
But I learned, and then
so I think as a society, we owe it to ourselves and to our future generations to be informed, to really read about everything, look at the news on both sides, whatever way you want to call it. I mean, I'm very much somebody that's in the middle, because I try to see both sides of the coin and I try to balance things out on what's going to be the best outcome for myself. And I think sometimes because I've had this experience of being, living in other countries, living in other places that maybe other people are not able to, I see what else is out there. You talk to somebody from Cuba that's escaped here, and I've got tons of Cuban friends. And they're all so appreciative and thankful for this country because you don't live that way in Cuba. And I've talked to people here that have gone to visit Cuba as a tourist, and they go, but it's beautiful, it's lovely, it's great. And I'm going, well, but that's the part that they want you to see.
Sure,
that's not the reality of what's going on in Cuba and how people live and how people starve and how they don't have any rights. They don't have any weapon, things like that. So I think the whole idea is, for me, is I learn something new every time I talk to you. I try to stay informed, but sometimes it's hard to, where do you look? Which way, which one is fake and which one is real? Sure. Which one, but I think if we all try to work and collaborate together as opposed to against each other, man, would we be a better world?
And I think that that's kind of why I was so appreciative of you willing to have the rest of our conversation with the mics on, because there are some things that, I consider myself to be sort of like bleeding heart liberal. I want everybody to get along. I want everybody to win. I don't mind participation trophies. Why would I be mean if I don't need to be mean, right? Mm-hmm. But there are some things that, to their credit, folks who would be on the opposite side of a discussion, as measured as they tend to be, and as much foresight as they tend to have, while it won't change my personal brand philosophy, I believe in love first and last and in the middle, right? And that should inform all the decisions and steps that I make.
Right.
I do believe that having some input from an individual who is measured, an individual who has the foresight and has done the calculations, that helps structure the initiative that ultimately will be consistent with my personal philosophy. With that in mind, as a person who has done a significant amount of traveling myself around the world, I recognize that there are different countries who do different things. I was surprised when I got off the airplane in New Zealand or Hong Kong that the police don't have guns, period, right? They don't have fake guns, nothing. They might have a stick and a handcuff, and that's really it. But critically, the citizens don't have guns. And I realize that it's a different society, right?
Difference. Yeah.
But in a place like New Zealand, for instance, the citizens can have guns, and the police do have guns. They just don't carry it on their person. They keep it in the trunk of their car. And so there's an extra step that exists between ready, fire, aim, right? So it's ready. Okay, there's a credible threat here, and I do need to respond with force. Let me go to the trunk of my car and get it.
Right.
And in this country, because there's we've really succumbed to what's known as propaganda. There was an initiative, if you're not familiar, in you might have heard of a TV show called Dragnet. If not, don't worry about it. But Dragnet is perhaps the formative police television show where they took real stories from the Los Angeles Police Department and put them on television, and they were very compelling stories, and in order to
show cops.
Sure. But it was actors and so forth.
Oh, actors.
Right.
Okay, gotcha.
But what they did, this was like in the 50s, I want to say, Dragnet.
Okay.
Anyway, the police would consult on the show, and obviously the police were always cast in a positive light. And then we started to, as a society, move toward police are the good guys going after the bad guys, the cops versus the robbers, right? And we started to rethink what policing is and what crime is in this country. Because again, if I own a store, right, I'll apples to apples. If someone steals from my store, right, it's a crime. They've broken the law, and I deserve to be able to hold them accountable through a criminal justice system that seeks to protect everyone in society. That's a fair statement, and that's if we're being black and white. But if a person comes in off of the street, oh, how about this? Just because it pulls on the heartstrings a bit. If a child comes into my store hungry, I could see the ribs. I know this child is hungry, and the child steals an apple and is eating the apple in the store. Is that crime, or is that poverty? You know what I mean? And a lot of people who want it to be black and white would say it's crime, or they would say it's both. But an objective person looking at this would see clearly, okay, this person cannot work.
Right. He's a child.
This person is hungry. This person would recognize that your primary limbic functions in your brain are to survive.
And that's where society has to work together, where the owner of the business can say, hey, I can afford to give this child. But
the fact is that rethinking that is kind of the order of the day with respect to the call for defunding the police. It really was a call to rethink what policing is. In other words, if we're going to attack crime, we don't necessarily need more guns and more tanks and more, facial recognition software and more sound cannons and on and on and on. We need Head Start programs, because there's a direct correlation between crime rates and Head Start programs, if they're available to people. We need access to jobs. Imagine the safest community in your mind where nothing bad happens. You might imagine something like a neighborhood full of mansions. And, you're not imagining a neighborhood where there's police on every corner.
Right.
And so any objective person who really stops and asks themselves these questions would realize that indeed most of the crime comes from impoverished people, communities, circumstances, and a lack of resources. When you look at places like Skid Rows and, where we live in Arizona, it's called the Zone, but it's effectively Arizona's version of Skid Row. You have a lot of drugs there.
Mm-hmm.
You have a lot of what could be considered criminal behavior, vagrancy, public intoxication, whatever it is that is going on out there. But if you approach that situation recognizing these are human beings, and these are people who perhaps weren't born with everything that I was born with, or do not have access to the things that are necessary for them to be full functioning adults, or there is a disconnect somewhere. Oftentimes it's mental. If you come with the human first approach, then you start to realize, okay, maybe there's something that we as a society can do to help. When you approach them as criminal first, then everything becomes criminal. And this is what happened in the early 80s with this country. I'm not sure if you know about this either, but I know a lot of our listeners know that the reason that crack was introduced to the United States in terms of our lexicon, but also in terms of our communities, was because of the CIA funneling drugs in through, I believe it was Nicaragua, to Los Angeles. And then they used a drug dealer to kind of filter it throughout the rest of the country. So this is documented. The CIA admitted it. That was how they funded a war, a Nicaraguan war. But immediately after that, what did they do? They criminalized drugs. You remember the war on drugs, right? Mm-hmm. And so rather than looking at these people like, okay, they're a victim of poverty, circumstances, et cetera, criminalizing the drugs allowed the state to imprison the people who were using the drugs, which again, that's a health issue in most countries around the world. It's not a criminal issue. People that are on drugs, they're not hurting anybody. You know what I mean? So they're not criminals per se.
Right. They need help.
Yeah. Right. But it depends on your personal philosophy. There are people, and I'm not going to say that they're wrong. There are people who would look at that and say, well, the law is the law. If you break the law, you're a criminal. Full stop. Right. But to those people, I refer back to the child stealing an apple. Does a child deserve to go to jail, or is this a function of any creature endowed with consciousness on this planet with a limbic system that will seek to sustain its own life in any means necessary? And once you start having that conversation, it really gives you a lane toward what is the goal of laws? What is the goal of policing? What is the goal of enforcement, and what type of society do we want to be? What type of people do we want? What type of legacy do we want to leave behind? My belief is that societies are measured by how they treat the lowest among them. And in this country, respectfully speaking, my belief is that this society treats Black women worst of all.
Really?
Women are treated worse than men. I think a lot of people would understand what I mean when I say that. And that Black people are often at the bottom when it comes to healthcare outcomes, when it comes to, we've seen the Supreme Court recently repeal a very significant access point to the upper echelon of society with affirmative action. If we want to talk about environmental, there's a term called environmental racism, where laws are set up to where companies can pollute in this side of town, but not in this side of town, because this is where all the mansions are, and so forth. And at various points in society, there's a pushback against Black voting. We see that's what's happening in in Alabama right now, with the Supreme Court ruling that Alabama did have to break up their one majority Black voting district into two to give the Black voice more power, and Alabama pushing back against that because they're able to retain more power, more voting, and so forth. And these are things, along with we need better trained officers. These are concepts that go back 100 years at least, and they don't work. And the proof is available for anyone to see. The thing is, it's beyond the comfort zone, the sensibilities, and really the desire to learn for most people. And so I would love to get your response. I know I'm giving you a lot, but
no, that's fine.
I'm
just trying to take it all in.
Yeah, there's a lot. Well, I do this every day. I do it day in and day out. And so,
this is what you do. You try to stay informed. You try to look at all the news outlet. You try to look, all the things and
of course,
things and things like that.
So
I'm just a regular person.
But that's the beauty of it, the conversation, and that's why I appreciate it. So here's another part. One of the things that we have to push back against is that there are a lot of conservative people who are able to concentrate wealth, and often wealth dictates their political views. But along what's part and parcel with wealth is power. So there are a lot of conservative people in power, in positions of power, and they're often in a position to shape the world in such a way to where it benefits them even more at the expense of other people. This is a function of human nature. It is not a black or white issue. It is human beings. Human beings can be greedy if left unchecked.
And I think it would be the same to say from the liberal side too.
Oh,
that there's people in power
absolutely,
that are going to benefit themselves. Yeah,
by far and away.
Yeah.
However, what we see more often than not in terms of the effects on Black life, and again, the lowest of us in terms of how we are treated, Black women, we see that the opposite end of the spectrum, where the bulk of the suppression comes from, tends to be from conservative circles. What we need to reconcile is that if we're all going to live in a country together, if we're all going to expect that each other has only themselves to blame or acknowledge for their success or failure in life, then we need to be realistic about where the starting line is and what obstacles lie in our path forward. And the fact is that a lot of people in those conservative circles look at conversations like these that don't affirm their view of the world as though somehow Black people are perpetually victims. And it's a very sad thing to come up against, because my belief is that Black people deal with the real more often than play the victim. Most people, most humans deal with the real. This is the reality of the situation. This is what I woke up to. This is what I was born into. This is what will happen.
Right.
You know, I
will never forget
what's that?
Ramses. We were having a conversation. It was outside probably, and while our kiddos were playing. And gosh, I think it was shortly after George Floyd died. And I was talking to you about, you know, just how you felt and how do you go to the store and things like that. And you just looked at me and you said, that's why I walk with my kid all the time. And it just hit me so hard going, oh my God, he has to actually think that if he goes with his child to the store, then he's not looked as a threat or,
yeah, sure.
you know, but just things like that where I would never think that, right? I mean, I'm a woman. I am Latin. Yes. But I'm white skinned per se, you know, these are things I would never think, oh, I'm going to go to the store with my child so that people don't think I'm a threat, you know? And I just remember, I went home and I told Ian, I said, oh my God, I said, he said that. And I had never even put myself in that position or even thought about that, you know, about how you would rather go with your child to the store if it's 8 o'clock at night so that you're not looked as somebody who might be a threat. And it's sad. I mean, it's a sad reality. That is, you know,
I appreciate you saying that. I don't remember that conversation at all, but the fact is the reason I don't remember it or me not remembering it
because
should
it's a reality for you.
Yeah.
And it's something that you deal with every day.
All the time.
Right.
So perfect. So, it's funny because, on Civic Cypher, Q and I were talking and we said, we had an episode where we discussed what it's like to be a Black man walking down the street at night and encountering a white woman, right? You can imagine being a white woman walking down the street at night and seeing a Black man. It might be scary. You're taught to fear things like this. And then, of course, we talked about a lot of crimes of poverty. And, you know, you can make a reality where a healthy fear of anybody on the street might be necessary if you choose to live in fear, right?
But this is where I go a little bit out of maybe that's what makes me a little bit different, is that I feel that you can create your own universe, your own destiny, your own by, how do you say it? Projecting it.
Yeah,
If
absolutely.
you project, oh, this guy's going to attack me, most probably he might, you know.
This is maybe, yeah.
But if you project, oh, this is just another person
walking down the street, minding their business.
Fine, minding their business. Your energy and your aura is also going to be different.
Sure.
Doing that, you know, absolutely. And I think that's where we all have to make a little bit of a better effort.
Well, watch this. So this conversation was that I had with Q was, again, for the benefit of our listeners. If you don't know what it's like to be a Black man walking down the street at night and your kid is nowhere around and you're not with, you know, your lady and it's just you and you're walking wherever you're walking to, you know, in this neighborhood, we can take walks, right?
Yes.
And then there's, again, you're a Black man and there's a white woman. It is among the scariest things that can happen to you. And the reason for that is because, and this is me talking to Q, I know if that woman is just slightly afraid of me, that could be a very slippery slope to my demise. The reason I say that is because we were both discussing how our instinctive reaction to a situation like that. And my instinct says, I need to cross the street so that I show her that I am not a threat and I intend her no harm. I need to get as far away from this other human being as possible, because the moment they put her face on the news and they put my drawing on the news, it's, you know what I mean? And I don't have to do anything wrong. I just know who society will support in the circumstances, and it's biased against me. And so I need to also fall in line and center this woman's feelings. And what ends up happening, because this is where the story came from now that it's coming back to me. that happened to me before. There's
Okay.
a woman that lives not far from here. She ended up coming to one of my businesses, and she's like, "Hey, I recognize you. I was looking forward to saying hi. You're always walking and playing with your boy and doing whatever. I was looking forward to saying hi one night, and then you just crossed the street and kept walking, and I just couldn't understand. And the thing is, I didn't think that I was offending her. I thought I was protecting me and
Right.
her. And I think that the reason I tell that is just so that it further illuminates the fact that there are different realities for different people.
different
And I try my best to recognize that other people will act in their own best interest. This is capitalism. Capitalism, in terms of an idea as a societal framework, has won out among the other ideas. And so this is what we're stuck with. And that allows people to be very greedy. It allows greed to dictate political outcomes and outcomes for people, life and death, communities, so forth and so on. But I believe in the human spirit. I believe in the human condition. I believe that we're all brothers and sisters. I recognize that genetically speaking, we're a lot closer together than we are further apart. I realize that we all come from a single point in time and geographically speaking, in Africa, between 50 and 150. Yeah. Between 50 and 150,000. Yeah. Yeah. And, I believe that the tie that binds is a lot stronger. And I appreciate you allowing us to have this conversation for the benefit of our listeners. It's a joy to talk to you. And if you're listening,
Thank you for having
absolutely.
me. I haven't contributed as much as you have.
Well,
but I love that you, whatever sparked the conversation makes you think all these, process it out loud, and have people listen and hear. And, yes, I have my own little tidbits that I can provide, but, I'm just one person.
here's the thing, and I know I've kept you a good amount of time, but here's the thing. If I'm not asked questions, we open with this. If I'm not asked questions, if the questions aren't asked, period, then we're not doing the listening that we need to do to grow. And we're not communicating the ideas that need to be heard and challenged critically. Because just because someone comes up with an idea doesn't mean it's a good one, doesn't mean that it's going to work. But good ideas deserve their day in the sun. Good conversations need to be had, and good questions need to be asked. And so for that, I thank you for coming up. And I believe you've contributed quite a bit. I would love for you to come back again. Let's do it again sometime.
To do this again. Yeah,
Absolutely.
that'd be great.
And of course, if you have any thoughts on the conversation that we've had today, of course, I'd love to hear from you. Please use the Red Microphone Talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. Or you can reach out to me at Ramses Ja on all social media. I'd love to talk to you. As you can tell, I love to talk. And the more communicating we're doing, I think the more we're growing. So until I hear from you, peace. This has been a production of the Black Information Network. Today's show is produced by Chris Thompson. Have some thoughts you'd like to share? Use the Red Microphone Talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. While you're there, be sure to hit subscribe and download all of our episodes. I am your host, Ramses Ja, on all social media. Join us tomorrow as we share our news with our voice, from our perspective, right here on the Black Information Network Daily Podcast.